All right. Good afternoon and welcome to today's conservation webinar, our Learning Farms webinar, ISU Extension and Outreach webinar. And so this is kind of a emergency webinar, I guess we call it. Hopefully some of this is not an emergency, but maybe timely topic that a few of us at least have gotten some questions about recently related to running short on water or concerns about water from a livestock perspective. And so we have Dr. Dan Andersen with us, that's associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Ag and Biosystems Engineering here at Iowa State University. And he's going to share with us a little bit some information that he's updated from Sean Schaus and Dr. Tom Glanville when there were questions about 10 years ago or 11 years ago around drought and concern about that. And so really appreciate everybody jumping on today. As long as my computer works, this is being recorded, so it'll be archived on the Iowa Learning Farms website, so that if you know somebody that might benefit from this, you can certainly let them know, and we'll make sure that we get some information out about it as well. And with that, Dan, I will turn it over to you.
All right, thanks, Matt. And as Matt mentioned, this really was prepared by Tom Glanville and Sean Schaus. I can't take much credit for it other than updating it and listening attentively the first time they went through it. So hopefully we'll have at least a few helpful tips and things you might be able to look for and do. I did want to start out with where we are for drought and maybe offer a comparison of how that compared the last time we experienced this in the 2012 sort of era, so that you can see how things compare. So this is just a map of the drought monitor. I have the website there if you ever want to go take a look at it, where we were on August 1st and where we were on September 28th. So I think really what you see is it's impacting the whole state. And this time it's really focused up in that northeastern sort of quadrant of Iowa. I know 2012 was a long time ago, but if you look back at then, it was the spring of 2013. So coming off the drought, what we look like, again, it was the whole state, although there was maybe a little more sign that both the state was coming out of it as we got into the spring, and it was located in a different region, right? So that time it was the Northwest. So we have switched maybe a little bit the operations that are dealing with this, but it is still, again, pretty much all over the state. I did want to take a look at stream flow and soil moisture in Iowa. So stream flow and topsoil moisture at least can respond relatively quickly to precipitation events. So I know at least in parts of northeastern Iowa, we've had some rainfall events more recently, and that has helped. And I know at least up at Leon Sheets Farm, his stream had gotten quite dry. And as we were talking before this webinar started, there's a wetland right by Nashua that had gotten quite dry. And you can tell that the rains have replenished at least some of those waters. Leon's stream near his farm is flowing again. The Nashua wetland had more water in it. It looked happier and better, but we still are exceptionally dry. And I think our soil moisture map for the whole state sort of bears that out. And then again, I wanted to harken back to maybe what that looked like the last time we were in this drought, at least for a point of reference or comparison. And there you can see the springtime flows, and I don't necessarily like comparing fall to spring, but it's what was easiest for me to pull some data out. You can see that most of the streams in Iowa were pretty low that spring. And as far as soil moisture, I did manage to get that map updated to September 30th, and it was in the same realm of dry, right? So this isn't an unprecedented event. We did see something pretty similar a few years ago, but it was what we were seeing. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but I think Sean put some great effort into making some graphics here on why drought impacts water the way it does. So it's not a surprise, groundwater responds much more slowly to rainfall than topsoil or streams. The water has to percolate through the soil. We have to have the soil wet enough that there's free water to move down. So it's not like a one rainstorm, a two rainstorm event will probably fix our water table in most places. It really will take some time and seasonably wetter weather to get us back to where we go. Many farms and rural water systems rely on shallow groundwater. And that groundwater that is, of course, replaced by precipitation and excess precipitation that drains down through the soil and makes them there. During drought demands, especially when we're still using that groundwater, the levels are going to decline. Well levels might decline to the point where they can't meet our water demands, at least on a daily basis. So here's just a graph, right, of what's happening. Normally, the water table is sitting at roughly that level. The bottom of that well is screened, and you can sort of see that in the gray bar. When we're drawing water down, you can see the cone of depression, right? And then it'll, as we stop using it, table will level out and fill back up. In our drought affected areas, all of a sudden we might only be using the bottom half or bottom third of our well instead of that whole screened area because the water flow just isn't there. The water table isn't high enough, and that gives us reduced well output. There we go. If it's just reduced water flow, there's a few things you can do. I feel like I missed a slide in there, but no, okay. The thing to think about is really we still have flow. It's not that the well suddenly went dry, but it's reduced flow. And one way to think about that is all of a sudden we might not be able to meet our peak water demands. And in this case, we've drawn what might be a typical water response curve for a farm, right? Overnight, the water demand is relatively low. As animals wake up and start drinking, water demand increases. As we get to late in the day, they might drink a little bit more. That's increased, and then it tapers back off. Based on how our well is performing, all of a sudden we might not be able to meet that peak demand, right? And that doesn't mean that we're out of water. It just means that, right, the cows can't all drink at once. So I grew up on a dairy farm. We had this happen to us. And we had an artesian well. It went into a surge tank at our farm where it could capture some water. And then as soon as that surge tank was essentially full, it trickle overflowed, right? And as long as that tank had water in it, we were good to go. When all the cows would drink at once, as more people in the area drilled some wells, we didn't have enough capacity maybe to keep that tank full, and we had to think about how to adjust for that. And there are a couple things you can do. You can try and do things to improve your overall water efficiency, things like conserving water. You can also look at reducing peak system demand. So improving water efficiency at a swine farm, you might think of that as making sure that we're using wet dry feeders instead of nipple waters. Unfortunately, that's not an emergency supply, right? That's something we have to do sort of long term. The other thing you can think about doing is trying to save water for only critical operations. And in this case, critical operations would be making sure that the livestock have water to drink, and if it's hot conditions, probably water for some cooling, and trying to minimize water uses for any other thing. Rural water districts in some cases might ask farms to install on-farm water storage, and that's essentially to even out that peak demand. Before we start running out of water, it's really, well, we just can't peak supply, right? You're at the end of the line. We might not be able to give you all the water you need right now, but if you can use it off demand, right, at nighttime hours, there's probably still water that can flow towards you. So some things to think about. For long term, right, not to meet an immediate problem, but for long terms, thinking about those water savings, any efficient water technology that we can add to a farm can be beneficial. It will lower our overall water demand for cases where we're dealing with this in the short term. The other thing is focusing on having multiple water sources available. That could be being hooked up to raw water, having your own well, maybe a shallow well, and having your own deep well. In all cases, that of course might not be possible, but cultivating some of those alternative sources is useful. You can also think about investing in water storage systems. I'll show some pictures later, but some of our farms in southwestern Iowa, where groundwater yields maybe are generally not as good as the rest of the state, already invest in some of that technology, and it can be a model that we think about. And really that's as simple as it sounds, right? We build a cistern like we used to build for houses. My house has one to store some water, and then we can draw water from there and keep refilling it. We could also start thinking about water reuse systems. But again, all those are sort of long-term investments, long-term strategy, not things that we do right now. So if you find yourself in a situation where your well isn't keeping up, some things that we need to think about today, prioritize animal needs. So focus on supplying that drinking water and cooling water and eliminating or limiting other water demanding activities. That could be things like washing, right? So it might mean that we have to try and wash less or try and use less water with each wash. So trying to come up with strategies for that. It could mean culling some of our livestock. I know oftentimes when we look at some of the western states, when it gets very droughty, they look at culling some of the breeding herd for cattle. And unfortunately, that isn't what we want to do. But if there isn't water, it is something that we have to start thinking about. Or relocating water to a different farmstead and splitting them basically between the two farmsteads to try and make sure that each well can keep up. Now, again, that might not be easy or possible, right? It sort of relies on having a place to go with them. Trying to identify alternative potential water sources. That could be pond, stream, or rainwater harvesting. Again, when you're in a drought, certainly those aren't always plentiful. If we are going to start pumping from a stream, depending on how much we're moving, we do need to get withdrawal permits from the DNR, and you would have to check quality for those sorts of things. It might be looking for emergency drinking water delivery, and that could be contacting a town near you to use the municipal supply of water, looking to neighbors with deeper well or higher yielding wells, and then finally installing emergency storage on farm. And really, we're going to focus on the emergency water storage aspect because that's something that we can do and manage. The rest of those techniques are sort of decisions you have to make and then have to look around your specific area to find, are there resources available and can we talk to someone so that we can use them. So on-farm water storage improves our ability of drought-stressed wells and rural water connections to meet the daily demands. So this is assuming that during times of non-peak use, essentially during night, we would be able to accumulate water, and then during that peak demand hours, we can supplement what we've stored to make up for it, or for what rural water is doing. So this is going to be hopefully a moving graphic here to sort of illustrate what happens. We're looking at that same water demand curve, that same water system supply curve, and then here's a hypothetical storage tank, and you'll see the water in it move up and down hopefully as we go. So there we go, right? Water demand is low. We see that the tank was filling. All of a sudden, the peak demand starts to be above what our system could supply. We drain that tank down, and then we'll start refilling it again. So that's the concept, right? It's not that we necessarily needed more water from our well. We just needed to make sure we were adjusting when we were using it. And that's something that we can do at most farms. It will take a little bit of modification, but it is something that you could construct and actually do. So a few things. Emergency water storage requirements. We're going to need high capacity, especially at livestock farms that have any size to them. And we'll go through some more details of what anticipated water needs per animal are. But we are talking large amounts of storage, thousands and thousands of gallons. It has to be something that can be obtained and installed quickly, right? Because when you recognize that you have a problem, we have to make an adjustment and do something soon. And then low cost. Mostly because we probably only rely on them in drought or other emergencies, unless we think about building some permanent sort of storage. So there's a few different ways to go about this. One is that permanent storage. So this is, if this is an issue that you've run into before, that might be something you want to consider. If you know that your well is sometimes pushed to its limit, this can be a great way to sort of remedy that situation. And then we can go all the way down to semi-permanent and completely portable systems, depending on if this is a one-time event that you don't think you'll have to deal with again, or if it's something that you might be able to make other use for. And we'll take a look at some of the technologies that are out there. So permanent water storage, if you're doing this, it has to be a standalone underground concrete tank. A basement built beneath a livestock facility cannot have a common wall between that drinkable water, right, and the manure storage tank. So if this is an option you're going to go, that's something that to be in compliance you have to think about and consider. These have really long lifetimes, right? So they are expensive for short duration drought use, but this is something that, like I said, a lot of people in southern Iowa, especially southwestern Iowa, think about for some of their livestock operations if when they drill the well, it was a low yielding well. This is just a picture of what it looks like. So this is just a little above ground little hut above basically a concrete storage, right? And you can see the pumps and control system sitting above. Everything else is below ground for the water storage. In this case, it was about 14,000 gallons of underground storage. They put a shelter on top just to house those controls. It was about $20,000 for the tank and shelter and another $10,000 in pumps and wiring. So it is a $30,000 investment, but for some sense of security, that can be worthwhile. If you're trying to respond to a drought situation, in this case, there are a few ways to try and erect semi-permanent water storages. We're really trying to build a shallow tank, and one way to do that might be with grain bin rings or to make an earthen pond. If you are using an earthen pond, a liner is definitely preferable. When the ground's dry, it really wants to soak in the water, so we don't want that water seeping away on us. So some of those plastic liners can work really well. You can build it quickly, hopefully in 1 to 2 weeks. They can offer relatively large capacity at a reasonable cost. It isn't portable, right? So it's there for one farm. It's exposed to all the elements. So that plastic liner will degrade, right, as sunlight hits it. It is subject to freezing, and that shortens some of the life, but we're trying to respond to a drought, so I think that's mostly okay. And most of the time, these will be open top, which can give opportunities for airborne contamination. Generally, that's okay for livestock, but not for humans. And then one drawback is you're going to lose some water to evaporation. We could do things like cover them, but it adds expense. Just some pictures of what it might look like. So this is just a grain bin ring, plastic liner inside, and then they filled it up. So that holds about 15 gallons if you're a 36 diameter bin and you're trying to get to about 2 feet deep. Over here you can see a picture of just a little earthen pond. So they've dug a hole, basically lined it with that plastic liner, had side slopes of 2 to 1. Probably don't get any steeper than that. And you can't get exceptionally deep, but you can get some storage in there. Most vinyl pond liners are somewhere in the neighborhood of $0.75 per square foot. We recommend somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 36 mil thick plastic. You should put an underliner underneath it. That underliner is just a geotextile material that protects the liner from abrasion from soil, things like rocks underneath. Well worth your investment, something that we've done for a long time on most manure storages and strongly recommended. You can see some other prices there. There will be some excavation costs and you do have to buy some materials. So these do add up. For about 15,000 gallons, if you're doing it above ground with that bin, we estimate somewhere in the neighborhood of $3,500. If you're excavating, just a little bit cheaper. You can see some of the prices there that were estimated, and those of course do fluctuate a little bit. They do sell some interesting portable collapsible tanks. These are basically little pond liners, but they've constructed or molded them with some supports to make them work. They're self-supporting, generally open-topped, although in the picture we show here, that's sort of an onion tank. They do put a little cover on top of it. They have limited capacity, right? Those tanks can only get so big. The ones we could find were up to 20,000 gallons roughly, depending on the brand. They're more expensive than those semi-permanent options, but they're portable. So if you're done with it, there's hope that you could potentially resell it to someone else or fold it up and save it in a lot less space for the next time you might need it, whereas some of those other things probably aren't very storable. There are covers available, like I said, but oftentimes they're not sealed. So again, chances for airborne contamination. Like I said, that's okay for livestock generally, but not for human consumption. And we are going to use some loss to evaporation. When you're siting these, it is important to get relatively flat and stable. So trying to put some grade on the land to make it flat, making a good firm base for it, because there's a risk of spills if not positioned on a good base. We don't really know the life of these systems, and it's probably greatly impacted by how you're storing it, how you're folding it up, and if anything gets in it and chews a hole. Some of them can be patched, some of them can't be, so that is something to be aware of. They do sell this other style, a pillow tank, and it is totally sealed, so you don't have evaporation losses or airborne contamination. Since it's sealed, it's stable, right? It's very portable. In some cases, I've seen people use some of these for manure application in the past, not generally in Iowa, but up in Wisconsin. So they'll fill them up as they're applying and pull out of them. So they're pretty rugged, can work really well. You can install them indoors. They are gonna heat up. Most water storages will, right? So with the sun on them, so that is something to consider, but water's water. You can see the top one here was shaded. Again, since it's sort of that plastic material, it does degrade from UV light. So it'll last longer if you can shade it or at least keep it out of direct sunlight. And here are just some example sizes that you could find online and give you some perspective of what you're looking for. So 20 by 20 by 3 feet is roughly 1,000 gallons. And if we make it a little bigger, you can get up to 20,000 gallons in there. Just a comparison of costs. So on the bottom axis here we have capacity and estimated or reported costs in dollars for that size, right? And the point being mostly from this is there's a huge variation in cost. The bin ring and the lined pond were generally much more cost effective, but like I said, they aren't transportable and they aren't very storable. So it isn't something that you could break out again another time. If you do start looking online for these, there is a large difference, and some of the search terms to look for that we found helpful as we tried to dig around: pillow tank, onion tank, water bladders, emergency water storage, things like that. And you can find them on Amazon and other places, but like I said, a huge variation in what people charge. There's a disclaimer note with Iowa State at that statement that we neither recommend or guarantee any of these products, right? So it's buy at your own risk. Most of them I've never seen other than on pictures online, so I can't speak to the quality of them. But there are some that are more costly, some that are less costly, and that's probably correlated to what you're paying for them. So there's my caveat, right? We don't recommend specific brands. It's for education and your use for perspective only. There is a fair amount of variation in delivery times, especially when there's high demand for some of these products relative to what they're used for, how often they're used. So that is something that as you're getting one, you should check into. When I got quotes, most of them quoted me 2 to 3 weeks for delivery. So if you need a rush or can find a supplier that would be more expedient, that would probably be useful if you're already experiencing problems. I did compare some of the onion pillow prices, and they have went up a little bit, but most of them are relatively similar to what we had back then, noting that I only got 2 quotes back since we decided to do this webinar. With bins and other options, it's best to shop around for the best price if you can. In addition to everything we priced out there, I was not giving you pumps, controllers, or pipings or electrical service. So that in order to get to the water to the barn, that is something that you'd have to consider. Okay, so estimating some costs, regardless of the system that you need, we are going to need to add a pump and a control system, get some wiring done so that we have electricity to wherever we're storing that emergency water, and that price and timing will vary with your site conditions and the local electrician, but they are definitely needed. Okay, so I wanted to get into how much emergency storage do we need? And really this is a it depends answer on what you're using it for. In general, with livestock facilities, we recommend 2 to 3 days of water storage, and that's really for a cushion of time to react if you have an issue. If your well would go down, or if your well would get empty because the drought intensifies, right? So at some point we might not have enough water to keep up, and that 2 to 3 day cushion hopefully gives us some time to prepare and respond. All right, so how much water do animals need? In this case, the recommendations for beef cattle are from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and they give 2 guidelines in gallons per 100 head per day, depending on the weather conditions. As we get hotter, we do need more water. So thankfully, as we get into the fall here, temperatures are coming down and we'll be more in the 70-degree or slightly lower range. Water use doesn't decrease that much as we get below 70 on a per head basis, but as we heat up above 70, it definitely increases rapidly. So when we're thinking about maybe our feeder steers, per 100, we're talking in the neighborhood of 1,300 gallons per 100 head per day. So you can really figure out where you're at, and that's setting your storage size. If we think about milking cows, generally 30 to 50 gallons of water demand per cow per day. That number comes from Midwest Plan Services. There is a fair amount of variation from farm to farm, but it at least puts us in the range. If we think about finishing pigs, this is gallons again per 100 pig spaces. I know with dairy cow it was per cow. All depends on where I'm pulling it from. This publication came from the National Pork Board, and it is dependent on the type of watering system you're using and the size of the pig being grown, right? So you can see that some water systems demand a little less, but in that general neighborhood of somewhere between 100 and 200 gallons per day for wean to finish pigs, and up to 500, 600 gallons a day for gestation farrowing barns where washing is a little more critical. If we're talking about birds, poultry, we have it for 6-week and 8-week-old broilers and leghorns, and former ISU employee Dr. Shin gave us that recommendation. You can see sort of there the numbers again for per 1,000 birds. We're looking at somewhere between 40 and 50 gallons per 1,000 birds per day. So just a few final thoughts before we get to questions here. Emergency storage can help a drought-impaired water source to meet daily peak demands. But all emergency storage alternatives require time to construct and install. As you're thinking about livestock facilities moving forward in the future, trying to build in that cushion to have multiple sources of water available should a drought happen so that we can use several of them, or having that fallback of a 2 to 3 day storage so that we can prepare when something happens is extremely important to responding to some of these emergency situations that we might be encountering. So certainly begin now to have a plan in place. But if you're already experiencing some of these, looking at some of those portable tanks or building either an in-ground or a bin lined tank system can be a way to get through a drought impacted situation. Okay.
All right, Dan, thanks so much. And folks have questions, type those in the chat box. Otherwise, I can also unmute folks too if you raise your hand or put in the chat box that you want to ask Dan a particular question. But to start with, if you would like a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And next one, Dan.
Okay.
Or next one on the
Yep.
demographic. Yep. If you watch this webinar live, please, if you're willing, fill out the demographic survey, iowalearningfarms.org/survey. You can scan that QR code. I see a lot of familiar names. If you've done one for a 2023 webinar, thank you very much. And you don't need to do another one, but if you haven't and are willing, that would be great. Okay. I don't know if there may not be a last one because since it's oh, okay. Yeah, if you're on here, next Wednesday, our normal time, we'll be having another webinar by Craig Clarkson with ISG that's going to be talking a little bit about urban infrastructure. So the market district green infrastructure. So, okay, I've gotten probably a couple questions here. So could you switch from hay to silage to help reduce water use in cattle?
Yes, but minimally.
Okay. Okay.
I know silage seems wet and it's 70% moisture when you harvest it, and there is some water intake from silage, but when you think about dairy cattle drinking 30 to 50 gallons per day, it's a relatively small change in terms of total water consumption. So that will help you out a little bit, but it's small changes. It's not a huge change to water demand.
So Dan, you brought up one thing, or as I'm thinking about this, we have some, immediate questions or concerns. I guess, for folks to plan ahead, obviously this is pretty dry conditions. We had it in 2012, but maybe for some of the climate projections, our wetter springs and drier summers in the future, might this be an area to maybe be somewhat proactive in thinking about what you can do for some of the water storage you have there, rather than thinking of it just reactively and
Yeah.
for example, if it's happening right now and you're trying to harvest and trying to figure out something, it might be a real challenge.
Absolutely. I think it's no matter what, it's going to be a challenge. Even if we
Yeah.
had nothing else to do, it's an extreme
Yeah.
challenge to manage water. But certainly with everything else going on, it is a problem. And it is something that we have to start thinking about more long term. And I think in some cases we have. More of our swine barns are built with that long-term water storage of 2 to 3 days of water stored next to them, which
Okay.
is not going to get you through long-term extended droughts. That's really designed to say, all right, I see that my water levels are consistently lower. I need to be doing something. I have to haul water. I have to move animals. But it does give you some cushion, right? And the same thing, we've seen more and more of our farms look at cultivating having more water sources. So being connected to rural water, having their own well. I've seen some where they have their own well, and where there's not rural water, they will have a storage pond. And that is something we definitely have to think about going forward. The unfortunate part is oftentimes droughts aren't just my farm, right? They're relatively regional. So many cases, what we'll do is, even if you have those multiple sources, say rural water and your own well, neither one might be able to keep up on its own. So normally I might use my own well, and now I'm going to try and supplement it with rural water, knowing that rural water probably doesn't have as much supply as normal during those situations. And I think that's what makes this a little bit more difficult. But trying to plan so that we have at least some of those storage systems and infrastructure in place can be really useful. So when you looked at some of the long-term strategies that I put on earlier, one of them was rainwater collection systems. That's not something we commonly do on our livestock farms, but we do have the ability to start thinking about it and collecting that water. Now, in all cases, we don't want that water sitting around. The drinking water recommendation we're giving of 2 to 3 days is mostly when you think about long-term water storage in a pond. That pond water may be good, or it may get contaminated with something, right? So one way to try and minimize that effect is to make sure we're cycling the water through. And 2 to 3 days is a good recommendation for that. If it is a full-size pond that might last you a month or 2 months, just monitoring water quality of that pond, I think, is useful. But it is something we're definitely going to have to start thinking more about. It's not something that maybe has been top of mind in the Midwest, where we traditionally try and get rid of 6 inches of water with our tile drainage system every year. But when you look at more arid regions of the United States and other parts of the world, it is something that has started to happen. Oftentimes at California, they talk about gray water systems, right?
Mhm.
Where the water might get used for multiple purposes, treated to some level, and then used again. Now, gray water is a lot easier when the ultimate use of that water might be irrigation, and we try and take advantage of it the first time and then use it again. But there are farms. There's a farm up in Wisconsin. I think there's 3 or 4 of them now, who have went to high level manure treatment. So basically an ultrafiltration where the last step may or may not be reverse osmosis. And oftentimes those farms will use that water as drinking water at the end, right?
Okay.
So it's a complete water reuse system. Now that doesn't eliminate our water, but it does keep it there. It keeps it on the farm cycling for at least some period of time and lowers demand of new water.
Okay.
Now those systems are kind of pricey, but given what climate demands you see coming forward, might be something that makes more sense.
Okay. All right. I think that's mainly the questions. Did you get any directly to you, Dan?
I did. I have one
Okay.
question, and it
Okay.
is
Awesome.
about essentially rural water or municipal
Okay.
suppliers, and especially understanding ahead of time how providers think about these things and how farm locations within the system may impact water availability during times of low availability. That's absolutely right. So how much water you get out of a rural water system is dependent on, they can meter you and turn you down sometimes, but it's also dependent on where you are on the line, right? So Matt and I both live in Ames, so I'm going to say I'm closer to the water plant than Matt. I'm not actually. We're about equidistant
Yeah. Yeah.
based
We're
on the
about
circle I
it.
draw about it, but it
Yeah.
doesn't work. So I'm going to say I'm closer. And if I had all my taps flowing and that pipe wasn't big enough, Matt would say, I don't have as much water as normal, right? And I'm not, I don't use enough water so Matt can notice, but where you are on the line might serve to function how much actually makes it to you. So understanding that constraint is important, right? Because if we are a swine farm near the end of the line, it is something where we'll see the impact first. And I think that's a great place to have that conversation with rural water networks. It's not that most rural water networks start running out of supply, it's that they can't keep up with peak demand. And as long as that's the case, then on-farm storage makes some sense, right? Because the on-farm storage allows you to sort of load level, will replenish at night when water demand from everyone else is lower. We fill up our storage and are good to go. Now, if everyone builds a storage and tries to do that at the same time and we're all trying to fill up at night, right? We've just moved our water demand. But as long as we come online sort of independently, that works to load level. And I think when you look at a lot of water movement or water industry, that's essentially what we're doing, right? We built locks and dams on the Mississippi to try and load level. So we hold some back, we let some go. And this is sort of the same concept. At many wastewater treatment plants, we don't want surge, we want relatively steady flow. So load leveling makes a lot of sense, but it is really about having those conversations with everyone in your area. For instance, if I start running out of water on my farm today, I have to find a source for it. So we did this at my dairy farm, my dad's dairy farm, when we ran out of water, you have to find someone who has extra capacity for you to use, right? And in some ways, we were lucky. People had dug new ponds for us. We knew the neighbors who dug the pond really well. It was easy to get permission and go haul water. Now, in full disclosure, we milked 40 cows, right? That is not very many when you look at how much water we moved. So we were hauling 4 loads a day, right, to supplement our well. 4 loads a day doesn't sound like much, but once you've done it for 45 days while you're waiting for a new well, it does add up in a lot of
Mhm.
time constraints. So I think that's one of the struggles is there's no quick or easy, we're just going to do this and the problem goes away. It's committed until you get a new well. Drilling a new well can be expensive, especially if you don't think you're going to use it long term. But we saw this drought, a similar drought about 10 years ago. We're seeing one now. At some point, having water sources, even if you don't use them all the time available to you, to supplement the water that you do have can be relatively useful.
Okay.
I did get a
Mm,
direct message about
okay.
any website location that monitors groundwater for Iowa. And man, I wish I could find one. There's the Iowa DNR puts out a water report, and sometimes that water report has maps of the groundwater well available, but they didn't have it in their most recent one. So I tried to dig for that and I could not find one uh, this week. But I know they've reported it in the past and it could be I just couldn't find it at the right spot. And I did just get a question about, is this webinar recording shareable to forward to others? Yes, and it would be on the Iowa Learning Farm website, and Matt can give you details about how to find it.
Yep, it will. I think as long as my recording works, it will. Liz and Elena will probably get it posted in the next day or two. So if you just go to there you go. Liz has got it on the in the link there. If I keep talking, Liz gets something done. So
And Iowa State's,
IowaLearningFarms.org.
yeah,
Yep. Oh,
yeah, and
she
Iowa
said
State's
it'd be
drought website is still available, so you can go
okay.
get the slides anytime from there, and there are some other drought resources still listed. Most of them weren't updated from 2012, but most of that same information is what we'd recommend and apply.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan, for this. Thanks, folks, for tuning in on short notice. And I think this is important information. If maybe this will bring the rain, and then we would be happy about that if we get prepared and then we get some rain. But thanks a lot, Dan, and thanks everybody. If you did need a CCA CEU, email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And with that, Dan, any last items?
Just remember that groundwater does respond slower, so even if we get rain, it is
Yeah,
something to monitor for at least some period of time, and then hopefully next spring we can stop talking about drought. But if we talk about it enough, we'll probably break it.
that's right. That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, one rain is not going to break it. We need some extended periods of rain, and hopefully we will get that.